So far, my videos have focused on where things stand now and how they got to be this way, versus now we'll turn to where they're headed. And in 1972, a group of MIT researchers looked into this question because they noticed that, well, previous civilizations have risen and fallen, many of them as a result of devastating their environments on a regional scale. And now, especially with the help of fossil fuels turbocharging everything, civilization has gone global. And our goals of our economy and everything that we do is we want to grow the economy. We want the financial values of things to increase. And all of that has a material footprint. And yet we only have one planet to work with. So which is it? Are we going to be able to keep doing the thing that we're doing and the thing that kind of all of our systems expect us to be able to be doing? Or is that going to come to an end? And so they ran all these various scenarios. They took a whole bunch of data. If you want to see exactly what the inputs were, you can look it up. But they simplified it as 5 curves. So you have pollution, which mounts because we're producing more pollution than the environment can absorb, so it starts to accumulate. Then we have a resources line that goes down because we are using up our resources faster than they can be replenished, so that's decreasing. And then those two activities, what that's really supporting or what's causing it is the fact that we try to increase our agricultural yields every year and increase our industrial output. So those two start by going up and up and up, and there's your economic growth. And then, of course, the goods and services that those are, they allow for an increasing human population. And so we also see the population increase. And those people are playing the roles of both consumers and producers or labor. And we need the machine, the system needs more of those players every year for it to grow. And what they found was that no matter what you do, growth eventually becomes contraction. And the study is called Limits to Growth and uses the word limits plural because they tried so many different things. They ran all these different scenarios, which you can learn about more. And no matter what they tweaked, you can never ever prevent the decline. Absolutely not. And the best that you could do would be to delay it until the end of the century, until around 2100. And then, of course, now with 50 years in the rear view, people have been collecting real data and plugging it into these models and comparing the reality to the various options that we had, right? Because the researchers in 1972 said, well, here are the various paths that we can choose. And at this point, it's like, okay, which path are we on? Which fate have we chosen based on real data? And it turns out that we've chosen the one where we absolutely do not heed the warning, exercise no self-restraint, and incur near-term collapse. And when I say collapse, I mean a decline in, specifically, quantitatively, agricultural yields, industrial output, and the population. Because obviously, if the pollution builds up, the resources are burnt through, and then you can't grow food or produce goods or provide services, because all of that requires fuel and machinery and everything to be functional, then you can't support a high population. So that would be happening, or beginning to happen, at least in the 2020s, or possibly at the very least in the 2030s. And then the downhill would continue for however long it takes us to reach rock bottom and wherever that is exactly. And a crazy thing is that this doesn't include climate change, which has 2 implications. First of all, if we were to solve climate change tomorrow, like right away, address it, and it is no longer a concern, everything we see here would still apply. It would still all play out this way in the near term. And it also means that because we aren't addressing climate change, things are still very bad and getting worse. That means that there's going to be a whole layer of chaos and negative influences on top of what is pictured here. So this isn't even showing the reality as bad as it's going to be. And I think that if you understand civilization the way that I've presented it in this series, then this is like a no-brainer. Like there was never any doubt or suspense about like, oh yes, which of the many dozen or more paths will humanity choose? Because like civilization is designed unintentionally to function as this like machine that just metabolizes resources at a rate faster than its environment can support. The study was pivotal in my understanding of how much trouble we're in. So I just wanted to take a moment to encourage you to learn some more about those curves. Here are some suggested sources. You have Breaking Down Collapse, episode 4. They spend a whole hour talking about it. You have my post 4.1 linked below, and it has a bunch of bullets of what I have learned after kind of like deep diving on how we're supposed to interpret what we see there, because there is more to it than meets the eye at first. And then also anything you can find with Dennis Meadows. He was one of the original contributors and has since done a few interviews and posts and stuff, so that might be valuable as well. So a way of looking at this that goes well with what I just showed you comes from William Catton and his book Overshoot. I'll start with the bottom quote. He says, "There were ecological prerequisites to abundance and liberty. Those prerequisite conditions are gone." So basically we've like driven over a cliff. The momentum is still carrying us outward, but we are bound to drop down at this point. And so a lot of the ways that we talk about our world and the way that we can make it better are actually just obsolete, and we just don't realize it yet. There's like a lag. And that is because, as I've already mentioned before, you need to colonize to access materials. You cannot access the materials at the scale that we do without colonizing. Like if you just, everyone stays home and behaves like all the other organisms in the world and minds their own business, you don't get to build cities. And then also, the reverse is true. You use materials to colonize. And so you cannot colonize without the materials. And we know that those materials, we are now depleting them so much that our access to them is going to be declining, which means that our ability to maintain our colony is declining. And the thing that the colony gives us, as Catton says in the above quote, which I won't read entirely, but basically he says that it was nations emerged during this few 100-year period because we've been able to suddenly take advantage of the entire planet's worth of resources. But then also we've quite suddenly now burnt through a lot of them. And so that means that now we're reaching the end of the possibility of the existence of that thing. And it's going to turn out that nations were temporary. And so a few things that the colony gives us are the things that I've listed over on the right. And I've intentionally capitalized and bolded the first letter of each one to indicate a specific way that we envision these things existing. So I'll just list them out and then I'll explain. So government and democracy, science and technology, development and economy, human rights, equity, healthcare, education, and social mobility. And what I mean to imply here is that like there have been and still are other human societies that are living very differently from ours. They don't have this weird energy intense way of kind of sealing yourself off from the world and living inside your, I use the metaphor of a spaceship in video 2, and then using the robot arms to take the resources and then bring them back to your pod. Like they are just directly interacting with their environment and not taking as much out of it. They have governance, they have decision-making mechanisms, they have knowledge, they've developed knowledge through experience, which like that is kind of a science. They teach, they impart wisdom, that is education, but it doesn't look like sitting in a classroom. So that's why I say that like the capital letter education of classroom-based learning and stuff will go away, but that isn't the only form that it can come in. And that what that implies is that the term sustainable development is an oxymoron. There is no such thing as development that is sustainable. It can never continue to exist in that state, our civilization, long term, nor is it something that can ever exist long enough for it to be extended to all human members of the civilization. We promise that to them because we feel bad about what we did in the past, but actually this whole idea of like a developing country with the implication that they will eventually become developed. In fact, we are all reaching a point where we will start de-developing. And what I have here is, again, I've shown this image before of this like chessboard, the trade-off. It's a dead-end blueprint that is designed to fail. And this is a list of all the previous civilizations, a timeline of them because they did overlap and they've arisen in different locations, not just in, European, North America, all that, but also in the South America, Central America, out in Asia, what have you. It never lasts particularly long because it's this boom and bust process, rise and fall. It isn't really designed to, it's a sprint and not a marathon, and it can't be any other way. There is no way, like, that is just inherent to how the civilization operates. And speaking of sustainable development being an oxymoron, another common phrase that I want to speak to is the if only. If only Exxon had been honest in the 80s, we could have done something about this. Or often in the headlines now, it's funny, there's like some apocalyptic type journalism where they're just like, civilization is doomed if we don't take these steps in this amount of time or whatever, which then implies that if we do take those steps or whatever, then civilization isn't doomed. But like only if you're assessing it according to those narrow parameters. If you consider everything else, because often we're talking just about the climate, if you consider everything else and just what is inherent to how a civilization operates, like I've said, that is a dead end blueprint. It is designed to fail. And maybe if you are just looking at one thing that you could fix, like, yeah, it seems like there is still time for us to fix that, and then that would be good, but it doesn't mean that it saves the whole operation. The operating method is just not one that can continue for a long time. And so the good news then is that, like, that operating method will end. We will no longer be able to maintain our structures or power our processes. And then the Earth, and what it does by continuing to operate is preserve the imbalance. So by then ceasing to operate, the balance is able to be restored. And so, like, no matter what, the future looks like this image on the right, where Earth has gone back to being all like wild as opposed to developed. As I said, the future is de-developed. But yeah, that is just, I feel like people confuse those things. Like when they say we're doomed, like who is that we? And sometimes they're referring to the planet versus sometimes they're referring to civilization itself, because the thing that they actually want to save is civilization. Like they want to improve, using that metaphor again, the spaceship so that it can be more benign, but it can't ever be benign. Slash people, and every single person is immortal, or sorry, mortal. Not if Elon Musk has his way. And so yeah, those things aren't the same, and in fact they are at odds. Like what it takes to fix our system, our man-made structures, and create more man-made structures, so maintaining them, expanding them, repairing what already exists, powering what already exists, that all requires taking from nature, which then does damage to nature. And so it's this trade-off, like either the planet is doing okay or civilization is doing okay, and whenever one gets better, the other gets worse. And of course, ultimately, because civilization getting better makes the planet in a worse spot, that ends up making civilization be in a bad spot anyway. So either way, it doesn't look good for this whole operating method that we use to meet our survival needs in this ultra complicated, materially intense way. So more often than not, I've been describing this one model that we have of meeting our survival needs, the civilization blueprint. And its key features are population density, usually in cities, where those people are subject to a division of labor, and then everyone is more or less like 99% supported by food that is coming from farms, large-scale agriculture. And so then instead of interacting directly with our environment, we all basically operate within our little pods and perform our specialized roles, and then we rely on these, the robot arms of the space station to go out and bring the nourishment to you. And so then, and then what you do to access that is you have to do the work to earn the tokens, which you then exchange for it. So it's this big, complicated method, and it has a very high material requirement and impact on the environment. But the thing is, because of these various forces that are going to be acting on us now, the decline in our ability to access fossil fuels, without which we can't engage in industrial activity, including the industrial activity which would have set us up with these technologies that were supposed to be everlasting and low impact or whatever, renewables, as well as an increasingly unstable environment. That whole plan is no longer going to function as well for us. And therefore, if there are any humans surviving after 2100, which I would say, and I get more to this in the next slide, but like, I'm not sure. It's possible that there will be some, and it's also, I can imagine all of the various things that we're going to be facing, making it so that there aren't. But if there are, and that's my point in this slide, if there are, they will be meeting their survival needs without that whole infrastructure. Instead, they will be engaging directly with their environment. So what I have listed here is, first of all, because they will no longer have supply chains, long trade routes, there will be some, I mean, there's always been some trade even among indigenous societies, but for the most part, they're going to be relying on whatever they can acquire directly around them within walking distance. So that is a limiter that we are not familiar with. Another one is that the energy that they are benefiting from is not going to be industrial type energy where you have engines that run on fuel or electricity. It's all going to mainly be whatever comes out of their own bodies. That's what they're going to have to work with as the energy. And so that's why that is also going to be hyper-local in a sense. And both of those will mean that their consumption rate as well as their population rate, because those two go hand in hand, those are going to be very modest. And I mean to emphasize the fact that what we have right now is extreme. We are not normal. Every other organism right now is being normal in terms of their consumption and impact and population level. This is a freak event that our species is experiencing. It'll turn out very briefly. And however, that doesn't mean that it's like ultra simple and chaotic and everything the way that they will be living. Looking just at the examples of human societies that have existed in the past and today who are living in this more direct, environmentally integrated way, there is still totally space for diversity and complexity. So for example, in terms of their homes, the shapes and materials that people could be using for their homes vary greatly, and there's ways for people to be innovative with that. I have some plant-based huts shown below, which are in existence today. The degree of nomadism can vary as well, depending on how settled they are versus how much they're moving around, how they meet their caloric needs, the degree to which they are hunting, foraging, cultivating, cultivating plants and practicing animal husbandry. That mix is going to be a very like create your own adventure based on which specific biome you find yourself in. And then I have some examples of these like interesting practices, again, that from real life examples of cultural values and practices that they have adopted to make do and make sure that they are practicing behaviors that can be a long-term plan. So for example, in the Oregon County, Aboriginal spiritual beliefs, ritual expressions, social sanctions, and territorial claims effectively moderated salmon harvests. Myths, ceremonies, and taboos restrained individual and social consumption, while settlement patterns and usufruct rights restricted access to salmon. So it's not like right now where we are just without any level of self-restraint harvesting all this food from the environment, leaving very little for other wildlife. They are keeping themselves in check intentionally, or at least they did. Another one is these groups in Africa. They organize themselves as mobile constellations. So you might have within one little community a maximum of 50 people and 10 of those huts that are pictured. But they knew people living within a 50-mile radius of them because they would gather to trade and share news and perform rituals. And so they still had this amazing, or they still do have this amazing network. And the average adult throughout their lifetime would learn skills from 300 different people because of all the interactions that they had. So it's a really still rich existence. I don't know if people in the future will be in contact with 300 other people, but still, this just goes to show that there are ways to live differently. And then also homes from 11,000 years ago were still organized into activity zones. So it wasn't like people were living in this mess of a way. There was still structure to how they lived. It just doesn't look in this according to this one narrow definition that we have of the way that you need to be surviving. So speaking of that alternative survival method, another thing is I think it is stereotyped as being scary, and it might be scary to us because we've been like domesticated. But if you want to know which model produces a ton of people with mental health problems, hold up a mirror. It's our civilization, not that. So anyway, coming back to this question of population and how many humans will there be in the future, I don't like to make predictions, but I will say that I think it's going to be way, way fewer than the 8 billion that we are at right now. Like, not a lot of people at all. Because when you think about it, here are going to be the factors of whether or not anyone makes it through to next century. It's a combination of both aptitude and circumstances. And so you're going to need those primitive survival skills. Since technology is going away, you are going to need to be meeting, or anyone who's interested in surviving would first of all need to be able to survive without reliance on stores and supply chains for food. You would need to be adept at sourcing it yourself through the various mechanisms, foraging, hunting, agriculture, or like cultivating, but on a smaller scale than our massive agriculture. So how many people actually have the skill for that, to do that year round for year after year? And then also how many live in a place where that is still possible? Because of modernity, we have all gone out and settled places where you can't have any of those options reliably, and it's been made possible because of this like life support system that connects them to places where the resources do exist. And so that's in places like possibly deserts, certain ones that were not highly populated before, as well as cities. So you run out of like weeds in between the cracks of the sidewalk to eat really fast. As well as like climate, maybe a forest used to be lush, but now it isn't. And then, so this is also what I was touching on the next point. So you have to think of it both in terms of how many potential calories per capita does that place offer? And if we have developed it, then we have reduced that number, because on both senses, you've got the numerator and the denominator of calories per capita. Well, when you develop a place, first of all, you pave over it and you build all these buildings, so that's reducing the calories that are growing there, and then also you are increasing the per capita, the population density, and so that number comes way down. And then also with the climate, because we are making it so much more hostile in places, stuff that used to be a great reliable food source isn't anymore. Chronic diseases, those microplastics and forever chemicals that are all just pumping through our blood now, those are causing everyone to get cancer and whatnot, and also lowering sperm counts. And so that's like a double whammy, because if we don't have the technology to cure the cancers and all the other diseases that we are developing as a result of civilization and it messing within the environment, then people will just be dying of those. So then there's a question of like, are they dying before they have a chance to reproduce? And then what about their kids? And then also the sperm counts. If you calculate that out, assuming it proceeds at the rate that we have observed it to be proceeding since in the last 50 years, around mid-century, you would see us become more or less incapable of reproducing. Of course, that's not necessarily what's going to happen, but if you just continue it, that's what it would look like. Also, without modern technology, how many people would voluntarily actually carry a pregnancy if you're just knowing that you're going to have to give birth without that, all of that modern technological assistance? I can see it getting pretty scary. Contagious disease, because of, at least for now, there are still so many of us. Diseases are spreading more easily. We're seeing, the first pandemic was bad and yet not nearly as bad as a pandemic can get. So there's still time for one of those outbreaks to happen, as well as violence. In times of natural disasters, you do see communities come together. Definitely, studies have observed that, but that is an observation that applies to a single natural disaster where you can count on a recovery, on like, this is just a thing that we need to get through together. But what you also see, and the trend that applies more so to our situation now, is that when a society starts to deteriorate and there are these new pressures arising, when things are getting worse and worse over a long period, actually then you see more violence and more crime, because people become disillusioned, and then you have terrorist cells and whatever format that takes. There's different terms for what differentiates a terrorist group from a gang or whatever, but people seek support and meaning and identity plus access to their survival needs, through that, which and war, duh. So then also this thing that people often say when they're talking about collapse is that it's not an event, it's a process. And what they mean is that, like in apocalypse movies, there's always like one big event. There's like a bomb that goes off, or a asteroid hits the planet, or there's a pandemic or whatever, and it like wipes out everyone in 24 hours. Or maybe there's like one survivor, and then like that's where the movie starts, because that's a fun way to start a movie. Or even, Noah's Ark, the idea of Noah's Ark, there was a flood and it wiped everyone out except for him, and then he got a fresh start. How convenient. In real life, it's just going to look like a more steady decline. Other people aren't going anywhere anytime soon, and so we will just see the situation deteriorate. So think about other places in the world where people are currently facing conditions where they are suffering more than you do when you look around. Like your world is going to start looking like that. And but at the same time, when I think about how long that's going to take, I'm suggesting that we're going to go from where we currently are to something very, very different, and that very, very different thing isn't that far in the future. So is it that gradual of a process? Maybe not. Maybe the change is happening more rapidly, and so it's some kind of hybrid. So that's why it's like a fast moving process. So when I first started learning about the limits to growth, my next step in this thought process, as well as for many others, because this is the whole idea behind the degrowth movement, is that like, okay, if nature is going to be imposing this ceiling that continues to lower on our consumption, and there's no way around that, well, then the least we can do is to accept it and like work with it, do it on our own terms voluntarily. But the thing is, we're not going to do that either. And here's some reasons why. And I've called this slide inflating until we pop, because the analogy is, well, you've got this balloon. You cannot inflate the balloon forever. Eventually, it has to go back to being not inflated. And so your options are to either continue blowing it up until it pops or allow it to deflate and control that. But because of the factors which I will describe, we don't really have the option to choose the voluntary, well-managed deflation process. So instead, here we have the maximum power principle. This states that even if you have a whole bunch of nations who are willing to reduce their footprints, if there is any bad apple in the group, anyone who is not willing to comply with that agreement, and of course there are all of the countries, there's still quite a bit of geopolitical tension, I think we can acknowledge right now. Not everyone is going to cooperate with the idea that we should reduce our consumption levels, and so anyone who doesn't reduce theirs is going to have the advantage in terms of how their economy is doing and also how their military is doing. And meanwhile, everyone else will have backed down because they thought it was an agreement that we were all going to abide by. And so now those other guys are in a vulnerable position, and the aggressor is going to be able to run the show. And we will see, just because there will be a few actors who are willing to continue increasing their consumption, they will pick up the slack. Whatever anyone else abstained from consuming, they'll be willing to just go in and scoop it up themselves. And so then on a global scale, you actually don't see that reduction in consumption happening, because whatever someone else doesn't consume, the other guy will. And so they don't achieve that desired goal that a few of them were hoping to collaborate on. The other one is cultural materialism. So I have that expressed here as this pyramid. And this is one of those things where it is very different from how we think the world works. But upon learning about this, and I just compared it to what you can observe obviously around you, and to me it was like, oh, this seems to make so much more sense as an explanatory framework, and that's why I have embraced it. And so what we typically think is that our values and beliefs are what influence how we've structured our institutions, and then that also then dictates how we interact with our environment. So you say like, okay, well, we want to be at harmony with nature. Therefore, we create this agency in our government that is designed to protect the environment. And then it will implement rules about how the people on the ground out there on the front lines, the degree to which they are allowed to pollute, and the practices that we implement for our agriculture. But it's actually the other way around. The infrastructure, which is the way that you meet your survival needs, influences structure, which is institutions, rules, kind of like explicit laws about how we operate. And then that in turn influences your beliefs and values. And so, as long as the infrastructure remains the same, namely, as long as we are organized as a civilization and you have people and this population density in cities and this division of labor and the survival needs, the needs for calories being met mainly by large-scale agriculture, and then people each specialize in a role, and then in return for the work that you do in this role that is benefiting the whole collective, you receive payment, which then you can exchange for the food. As long as that whole thing is still up and running, we aren't going to be able to imagine anything different. And in fact, even when there's some cracks in it, as we saw during the COVID lockdowns, all people are capable of doing, like, we are still insisting on, like, oh, back to normal. We can't, or people, I mean, I guess people might have imagined, like, oh my God, this is the world ending or whatever, but like, they don't really take that belief seriously. They believe that as long as we patch it up, this whole thing is going to be able to continue functioning, when in fact it will not. But that is too mind-blowing for people right now because the infrastructure is still in place. And so also, for example, the travel infrastructure. As long as planes are kind of able to take off, we will not be able to imagine an end to travel, hospitality, and leisure industries. And so, it's not, and even though airplanes are now like often up to their wheels in water, because all of these airports are being flooded by this crazy precipitation patterns that we've been having. So, because people don't understand that those things will go away as a result of us continuing to operate as we do, they aren't capable of making the calculation and being motivated to bargain and give those things up in advance to hold on to just a little bit more planetary stability. Then also leaders' obligations. This relates to the maximum power principle, but in terms of like both geopolitics and internal politics with the citizens, if it would be irrational for one leader to reduce their country's footprint precisely because they cannot trust that every single one of the others will agree to as well. So they're simply behaving rationally. And of course, if they didn't, then the citizens come into the picture. The citizens aren't going to approve of that decision, even if some of them are super environmental and understand what a position we are in. There will also be those who refuse to accept that these are the terms that we are now needing to operate according to. And so they will vote the person out of office. So the politician always has to do what is going to make their people, who are not necessarily thinking in an informed way, happy. Another thing is their colleagues. Like we aren't great. In most countries now, you're seeing polarization occur. And so because of how our government is structured, you would have to get people on board. You have to get every member of your party on board and the other party with this dramatic change, which just isn't ever going to happen. We can't even pass simpler laws. And then finally, the fact that it's hard to restructure an entire civilization to be less civilization-y. This is a big job that we would be talking about, and so it is just too hard to pull off. Politicians are busy. They've got more immediate concerns, even though this is a big one. It still feels very far off to them. And then finally, our financial system and the economy. Corporations compete by expanding their market share. They're supposed to be growing and contributing to the growth of the economy, which correlates to resource consumption and environmental damage. Or else they will lose business, and they don't want to do that. And the same thing, our debt structure. I explain more in my Substack, but basically individuals do not have the option to opt out either. We are all locked in to continue supporting this mission to destroy the planet that none of us actually agreed to or is even aware of. None of us realize that once you add up all our individual actions according to the civilization model, the impact that it is having is to suck the environment dry. And that is why I use the word superorganism. I may have mentioned in my first presentation the term, I definitely mentioned ultrasociality. When you have a species that organizes itself according to these rules of ultrasociality, we describe it as a superorganism because they are all kind of amounting to one big amoeba that is also having this outsized impact on its environment. And ours is operating, as they all do, on autopilot. So in a moment, I will toss two quotes up on the screen that I think do a good job of communicating some important things about the situation that we find ourselves in. The first one is about control. We never actually consciously decided how civilization would operate. It was a system that emerged. And then most of us over the centuries have been born into this, and we weren't deciding that, like, yes, we are going to keep doing this agriculture thing, which is then becoming the main sustenance for the dense population in the cities, and everyone is performing individual jobs, and we are obtaining our survival needs in this indirect way, separating ourselves from the environment and from the experience of nature that all other organisms have. Like, no one is really making that happen. We are all making it happen through our collective actions, and we aren't conscious of what it is doing. Like, we don't realize that this organizing method is the thing that is causing all the problems that we're seeing and cannot continue. So nor do we have any control from this point forward over how it proceeds, because you're just talking about 8 billion people individually doing actions and then all of those adding up, and you cannot control and corral 8 billion people and bend them to your will and make them all cooperate to do something, which also, what would that something even be? There is no clear answer of like a response that would be preferable, palatable, appealing to all of us members of the civilization. So we're quite stuck. And then the other quote is about how what we will manage to do for sure is greenwash all the way down, because that's our favorite way to convince ourselves that like everything is okay, we meant to do this, it's gonna, like, this is clean energy and any minute now it will kick in and let us have both the functional civilization that can last forever and a happy planet. We'll see how that goes. And often when I point out all the flaws with the plans that people have that they think will resolve all of our problems, then they're like, okay, well, fine. If you don't like my plan, do you have a better plan? And like the whole point is that there is no possible plan that would result in a win, because we are on the team that is causing the problems, although it's not any of our intention. And so there is no way for our team to win and get what it wants, and for all the other forms of life to also be okay. There's a term for this in chess. It's called being in Zugzwang, which just means like you have to make a chess move. It's your turn, but there's no good move that you can make. No matter what you do, you're going to lose. And that is the position that we're in, because every time the sun rises, everything has to switch on and operate. And our activities, especially if they are supporting the civilization and functioning within that operation, and therefore it's just going to keep continuing having the impact that it does on the environment, which is a pernicious one, things are going to get worse for life on this planet, which then means it's worse for us, at least as long as civilization operates. Once it stops, then other life can start to recover and come back into balance. But for now, we're in a real lose-lose situation. And so that's why people who are aware of this will use the term predicament to describe it, because a problem has solutions. A predicament does not have solutions. It only has responses. And I will get into some of those responses in video number 7. But for now, I'm done dropping all the gloom on you. And in videos 5 and 6, we'll actually step back and look into the way that the perspective that most people have that prevents them from seeing things this way, and it is the most common perspective, and we'll look at the psychological factors, the cultural ones, that keep us from being able to understand our situation accurately. And then we will look at some of the irrational beliefs and behaviors that it inspires. So that should actually be kind of fun, right?